has certainly, I will wait. That's the last one. Anyone else need one? We have one left. You want one? Did you? Yeah, right there, Brian. Oh. All right, if you didn't get one, I'll have some available for you next week. So you can keep this in your files and refer to it. And you can listen to whether it's Bible teaching or commentators on TV or whatever to see where they might fall in these basic views of man's nature and how does man change or direct his behavior. It's important to know these differences because they can cross over into what on the right side of your sheet is what I'm calling the biblical viewpoint, and I want you to see how they contrast, which is why you may have heard some pastors speak against counseling because of psychology, and there's some truth to those complaints, and you'll see why hopefully from this. So we have existential viewpoint of life, Freudian psychology with the id as the focus, then Freudian psychology with the ego as the focus. I didn't put the third one, which is the superego. That's sort of a conglomerate of the first two, but those two are the ones that are usually more distinct. Then there's Rogerian psychology, which is Rogers and Skinner's, called Skinnerism, and then Eastern mysticism, and then biblical. So when it comes to man's essence, what man is as a being, almost all of them look at man as being purely material. Eastern mysticism looks at man as being spiritual, and the Bible looks at man as being primarily spiritual, but also physical and mental, which we talked about today, mind, soul, body, and spirit. But what the Bible presents is man has an eternal essence, an eternal being that is spirit, because the physicality will not last. So that is a distinctive. And remember, biblical faith is Eastern in its origins. Judaism and Semitic faith and early Christianity was of Eastern philosophy, not Western. Western is very analytical and linear. Eastern is more embracive, which is why a Jewish person would have no problems with conflicting information about God, such as man can choose to love God or serve God, or God chooses man to do it. Well, is God sovereign and does man have free will? Which one is it? Well, the Jewish mindset was that shows you that he's God. Because as a human, you can't comprehend how you can be both. Western theology has to rectify that question. We have to have an answer to it. It has to make sense to us. But Eastern thought is a little different. It's always been more spiritual than material. Man's being. Existentialism, he's aimless. The existentialism tells you the meaning of life is there is no meaning. That's the purpose. So we're just an aimless animal. And Freud, the id, he's a driven animal by instinctual desires. That's what drives man. He's a driven animal. And the ego, of Freudian psychology, he's a logical animal. That means his mind can take factors and apply them to decide what he wants or wants to not do. In Rogerian psychology, man is basically a good animal with good intentions. Goes bad only if certain things happen. In Skinnerism, he's a controlled animal. That means in Skinnerism, behavior is altered by conditioning. And so you're controlled by how you are conditioned. So when a man goes off the rails or stays on the rails, it's because conditioning keeps him there, so he is to be controlled. In Eastern spirituality, man's being is a journeying spirit, either through many eons of time, like in reincarnation, or on a path journey of discovery, which will lead to oneness, at one-ment with the universe. In biblical thinking, man's being is body, soul, and spirit. And you can't separate them without killing the individual. Man's virtue in existential philosophy, there is no standard for good or bad. So it's irrelevant. Existentialism leads to great cruelty and callousness because there is no right and wrong. So what happens is, it's almost like the survival of the fittest. Whoever has the strongest desires, passions, and power gets what they want. And that's perfectly okay because there is no real good and bad. There are no absolute truths in existentialism. In Freudian psychology, the id, man is basically selfish and sexual. That means almost every drive, now man means man and woman, every drive somehow ties to sex. And of course, a lot of that has been dismissed in modern psychology, but it was the root of Freudian psychology for years, that there's a latent stream of sexuality that corrupts, perverts, directs every decision man makes. In ego psychology through Freudian, man's virtue is bad, but the embryo is good. That means in his early days he's fine, but things come in and make him turn bad. In Rogerian psychology, man is internally good, but he's affected by the external bad. So in Rogerian and Skinner psychology, you work on removing the things in life that have made you become bad because you're basically good. But in Skinner, you're neither good or bad, just like existentialism. It's just behavior. Your virtues are controlled by conditioning, like Pavlov's dog, where you ring the bell, give him something to eat, ring the bell, give him something to eat, ring the bell, give him something to eat, and the dog's mouth begins to water. You ring the bell and offer no food, and the dog's still mouth waters because it's the bell that's triggering the appetite. That's Skinnerism, that you and I can be trained through repetition, where our motives will be because it's been conditioned, not because we have any true latent or passionate desire within us. Man's virtue in Eastern, potential for good and bad. It's where you get the yin and the yang. That's that black and white symbol of the like two little tadpoles swimming on each other, the yin and the yang. That means there's always good and bad. It's the principle behind the Force in Star Wars, that there has to be good and bad. That's what keeps the balance in the entire universe. That's Eastern mysticism. By the way, if you're a Star Wars fan, and as a movie and a storyline, I always was, but it is Eastern mysticism being taught in every movie. The Force being with you, and it being neither good or bad, and your belief or lack of belief is what triggers the power of the Force. That's all Eastern mysticism. Yet you can take it, and you can do some great Bible lessons from it too. But you got to stick the Bible in there, because that ain't in there. But Eastern mysticism is very similar to biblical theology. So man's virtue in the Bible created good in God's image, but became bad through sin. We fell, but we were made perfectly good. Man's meaning in existentialism, it's random. No purpose, no meaning behind it, no direction. It's random, and it's relative to what's going on with other people. So your meaning is based upon where you're at in any place and time or geographical location. Freudian psychology, the id, your meaning is in accepting your animal nature. I had a professor once when I was in high school, when I didn't know what existentialism was, when he wrote on the board, "The day you were born, you began to die." And he said to us, as soon as you accept that, you will be happier. That's the idea of this accepting a harsh reality as being true allows you to make progress. And of course there is truth in that. But when it comes to life's meaning and purpose, that's a very dark way to look at life. Accept your animal nature and work with that, not your spirit and not your mind. In Freudian psychology with the ego, accept one's biological identity, and that has fallen out of favor because biological identity now, other than human, is rejected. You determine what you are, and you can alter it. You can decide, even if your body tells you you're not. Rogerian psychology, man's meaning is in knowing yourself. To thine own self be true. Know who you are and be that, which is fine if you're an upstanding, good, gracious, loving, kind person, but what if you're a serial killer? What if you're a deviant? That's not good advice. But if there's no necessarily bad or good, doesn't matter. Skinnerism, mechanistic, chance, and evolution. Your meaning in life is that by pure random chance, you have come to be. There is no purpose outside of that. Man evolved. and that's your meaning. Years ago when I was in 10th grade, I just moved from here. In December of 72, moved to Georgia, and a man came to preach at the church I was then attending, and he came to preach about creationism. Well, I bought 10 of his books and read them all, and thought about putting together a presentation on it. Well, I was in a zoology class with a man named Mr. Campbell, if I remember his name. And at the end of the year, he said we could do a special, well, we were required to do a special project. I asked him, could I do mine on creation? I remember he laughed. I thought, he goes, you believe in creation from the Bible? I said, yes, sir. He goes, all right. He goes, you can make your presentation, but you got to give me the last 10 minutes to ask questions. Well, this guy who wrote these books was a whole lot smarter than Mr. Campbell, and a whole lot smarter than me, of course, so I just took his notes and put together a presentation of why I knew we were created, not evolved. And at the end of the presentation, I said to the class, now I need to stop now because Mr. Campbell wants to ask questions for 10 minutes. But before he did that, I made the comment to the class, if what I'm saying is true, that we were created by a creator, that means we have a purpose in fulfilling our role. And if you want to talk about it after class, I'll be happy to talk to you about it. So when I made the comment, Mr. Campbell stood up and said, class dismissed. So he dismissed the class with 10 minutes left in the class. So about 10 kids came up and sat in the front. Campbell was gone. I gave the gospel, and some kids got saved. It was because of that question. Mechanistic chance random evolution gives you no meaning or purpose at all other than survival. Creationism, that there is a God who made us, gives you the full essence that you were designed to be something for somebody greater than you. In Eastern mysticism, it's karma and recreation. Whatever you're going through, don't worry about it. Karma is going to make sure whatever you've done comes back to you, and you get to do it over and over and over again. Each time, hopefully, ascending a little higher and a little higher and a little higher until you reach one-ment with the universe, nirvana, and you've ascended into one of the light beings. That's Eastern mysticism. But in biblical psychology, man's meaning is accepting one's purpose as a creation of God. So you and I are not God. We are the sheep of His pasture. That means we are to obey Him. That's why Solomon said, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter in Ecclesiastes. Fear God, keep His commandments. That's the whole duty of man. That's our purpose. The world hates that purpose. Man's fulfillment. Existentialism, whatever means as effective. How do you get fulfilled? Whatever works for you. Back in the 70s, the phrase was whatever turns you on. And if you all know if you remember that phrase, that was existentialism. Whatever works for you, it's fine. Gratification and indulgence is for the id in Freudian psychology. Gratify that passion, indulge it, and you will have fulfillment. In the ego psychology of Freudianism, it's rational choices for gratification. Yes, you can have that and make you feel better, but your rational mind tells you, if I do that, I will cause more trouble because that's illegal, or the world hates that, so I'll make a different choice, but I'll still indulge and gratify myself, but with more rational choices. In Rogerian psychology, it's self-realization and self-expression, which is the ultimate height of Rogerian psychology, to know who you are and to express it. And you see it in commercials, you see it in TV shows and songs. Express yourself. That is the ultimate identity and purpose of man, is to know who you are and express it. In Skinnerism, it's adjusting to the prompts of external stimuli. That means your fulfillment is to learn how to respond rightly to the things that are outside that are conditioning you. Learn the lessons. That whatever is it that's out there that's trying to teach you, learn those lessons, the external stimuli. The Eastern mindset is different. Accepting life as is and then striving to improve it. Eastern mysticism is about transcendence, even if it's not there. I was raised in an Eastern mysticism religion called Christian Science, where we were told to deny pain, to deny suffering, to deny sickness. I spent the first 13 years of my life with a devoted Christian Science father. And if I was hurt, you get up, you go back outside and play. You're not hurt. You think you're hurt. Don't fall for that lie. That's error. Reject it. Act as if it didn't happen. It's hard to do when the injury is bad enough, but it's part of that idea of accepting life as is and then working to improve yourself. And it's a passivity that seems admirable when you watch John Carradine in Kung Fu back in the 60s and 70s. He was always the passive, calm, cool, righteous one with all the Western Americans pulling their guns, fighting, greedy all the time. But here was this Eastern Kung Fu monk who was just peace, but he could also kick you all the way into unconsciousness. He was the epitome of what a man's supposed to be. That was Eastern mysticism. You accept, you go with the wind. That's why a willow lasts longer. A palm tree lasts longer than an oak tree. Oak tree is American and strong. A palm tree is Asian and it blows in the wind, but its roots are deep. It lets the wind blow. It's that kind of idea. In Christianity, or biblical Christianity, striving to fulfill one's God-given purpose. That's how we get fulfilled, is fulfilling our purpose that God has given us. And man's problems, how do you address them? Or where they come from? Existentialism, attempting to find meaning in a random world. In other words, if you're trying to find meaning in this messed up, random world, you're going to be frustrated and upset and have psychological issues. So the answer is, don't try to find meaning. In Freudian psychology, the id, it's denying your drive for pleasure and power. Denial is the problem in the id psychology of Freudianism. Don't deny yourself. Denying is bad. I do think that there's some truth to that, like in dieting. Denial in dieting is a counterproductive measure. Moderation is a better way to diet. Denial, our bodies weren't designed for denial. If you deny yourself something long enough, it snaps back and wants more. But if you moderate, you can govern your behavior. Well, in Freudian psychology, don't ever deny your pleasure or your desires. And Freudian psychology, ego, it's inhibiting your reason, your logic, and your decision. So your problems come from you're not thinking right. You're evaluating things incorrectly. And that's the sole issue. It has nothing to do with your nature or your sinful desires. It's you're not thinking right. That's with the ego. That's why the ego and the id put together become the superego, where you're a mix of those two, which came much later in his psychological development. Rogerian psychology, being unable or prohibited from finding self. So your problems all stem from not being able to figure out who you are, actualize it, and express it. So if something or someone is keeping you from it, that's your biggest problem. Break free from that and your problems will disappear. Skinnerism, being subjected to bad stimuli and environment. So again, your problems don't come from you have nasty desires. It doesn't come from you have a sinful attitude, you have a flawed character. It comes from your environment. Simply get you out of that environment and you're going to be a shining star. In Eastern mysticism, allowing current life to hinder your progress. Whatever's going on in your life, you're reacting to it rather than just passing passively through it to the next phase. Allowing the hurt, the pain, the disappointment, the betrayal to prohibit you. There was a great line in that Kung Fu show I just thought of while I was saying that. Back when Cain, the little boy, when he was being trained in the monastery, the monk monastery, somebody lied and betrayed him. And he was never going to believe again. And the old blind monk who called him Grasshopper, he said, Grasshopper, if a carpenter's on a roof and he hits a nail and the nail bends, does he never trust a nail? That was the great wisdom. Like, you can't let what happened just now affect your future. There's some truth in that. But in terms of your life, current life not only hinders your progress, it directs you. We're on a journey where every step leads someplace. So in the Bible, man's problems are refusing or failing to adhere to God's commands. This is not accepted in our world today, but it is the biblical way to look at why we get into trouble. And then solutions. We'll close with this. Existentialism. accepting that there is no meaning, afterlife, or absolutes. Though the solution to all your problems is just to accept there's no meaning, there is no afterlife, no moral absolutes. So then you're free to jump over to Skinnerism and simply are Rogerian and express yourself, because there is no right or wrong. That's close to sociopaths and psychopaths. Freudian psychology, the id, your solution is fulfill your desires in a socially acceptable way. So don't change your desires, don't assess your desires, don't look at them as being good or bad in the eyes of God. Just whatever you desire, find a way to do it in a socially acceptable way. But as we've seen in the last 40 years, or even less, social accepted ways have moved way over here. So now a whole lot of behavior that wasn't considered acceptable back here is acceptable now. Well, what if we get into a culture, and I hate to use the word Nazi, but like in Nazi Germany, where it was perfectly okay to turn in your Jewish neighbor who was hiding, so they go to a death camp, and you get to have all their possessions. That's socially acceptable. Well, does that make it right? But when you remove moral absolutes, anything really is possible. Man's solution in Freudian ego psychology, using realism and logic to check self-gratification. Not to deny it, but to check it, to direct it, using your mind, using logic, using assessment abilities. Rogerian, discard external direction, be true to yourself. Means listen to nobody. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. I'm my own boss. That's Skinnerism. That's Rogerianism. Be true to yourself. Discard external direction. The solution to your problems, if you're into Skinnerism, is exposing self to good environs and stimuli. So you get out of the bad stimuli and put yourself in a good scenario. And we often do that in our own lives when we're dealing with issues, quitting that job and getting a new job, leaving that house and going to that house, thinking the grass will be greener, but whenever you go, you're taking yourself with you. So the same issues follow you, but in Skinnerism, changing your environment, and there's truth to that. You know, it is always, if everybody hates you and you go to a group where everybody likes you, you're going to be a lot more content and productive and happy. That's true. But in terms of the way you focus your life, it can't always be escapism. You can't always get out of a bad and get into a good, because you often don't even know what bad is waiting over there in the good, because you've never been there. But it's there in every scenario. Biblical psychology or biblical human development. What's the solution? Repentance, surrender, and obedience to God. So as you look down the biblical, if you got rid of the other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, other 6 categories, and just scooted biblical over there to those other categories going down the side, you will see a rigid but freeing way to live your life that has the ultimate end of pleasing God, which will fulfill you and then has a greater reward in heaven than you can possibly get here. Which is why Paul said, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. That's a biblical attitude. That the afterlife really does exist. It really does matter. We are creations of God. God is giving us rules to follow. He wants to use us. He wants us to please Him. He wants to bless us. He's given us guidelines and rules and commands. If we do that, we will be just fine. Simplistic, black and whitish in its creeds, but far more solid than the subjectivism of all the others, which are simply whatever you think is right. Okay, anybody have any questions? For all those who are watching on live stream, we're going to have a word of prayer and let you go, because you can't hear the questions anyway. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the chance to discuss these things, and I pray you'll help us to get a good grasp of what a biblical approach to human development and behavior is, so that we can recognize when the other forms sneak in, and we can learn to apply what's good and eliminate what's bad by looking at it in the light of Scripture. And we ask that in Jesus' name.